"You're not family anymore, Eleanor," my daughter-in-law said as if she were commenting on the weather. The room fell silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall behind the attorney's desk. Vanessa Whitmore sat across from me in a tailored cream-colored suit, her posture relaxed, her expression confident. Beside her, my son Brian avoided looking directly at me. He stared instead at the polished oak conference table where the future of our family was supposedly about to be decided. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and offered no response. That seemed to disappoint Vanessa. She wanted a reaction. She wanted tears. She wanted outrage. Most of all, she wanted proof that she had already won. 3 months earlier, I had buried my husband of 46 years. Charles Whitmore had built a successful property management company from the ground up. Together we had spent decades creating a life that felt unshakable. Now I sat in a law office in Greenwich, Connecticut, listening to people discuss my future as though I were no longer in the room. "The documents are very clear," Vanessa continued, turning toward the attorney. Charles intended for Brian to take over everything. The attorney adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should allow the reading to proceed before discussing conclusions." Vanessa smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked pleasant from a distance, but cold up close. "Of course." Brian finally spoke. "Mom, nobody wants this to be difficult. Nobody wants this to be difficult." I almost laughed. The sentence sounded rehearsed, polished, carefully selected during private conversations I had never been invited to join. I studied my son's face. At 45, he still had traces of the boy who used to sit beside me during thunderstorms. But something had changed over the years. Little by little, decision by decision, he had stopped trusting his own judgment. Now he simply echoed the strongest voice in the room. The attorney opened a thick folder. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unusually loud. "As stated in the will," he began. Vanessa leaned back comfortably in her chair. Brian released a slow breath. Across the room, a framed photograph of a sailboat hung slightly crooked on the wall. For some reason, I found myself staring at it. Charles had always straightened crooked pictures immediately. He used to say small details revealed larger truths. If something looked wrong, it usually was. The attorney continued reading. Legal language filled the room. Trusts, holdings, asset transfers, beneficiaries. The words blended together like distant traffic. Then I noticed something strange. The attorney's voice lacked conviction. Every few sentences he hesitated. Not long enough for others to notice, but long enough for me. Vanessa noticed nothing. She was too busy celebrating. Brian noticed nothing because he was too busy worrying. But I noticed, and for the first time all morning, I felt a faint spark of curiosity. Something wasn't right. Something hidden sat beneath the polished surface of that conference table conversation. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and glanced at me with open satisfaction. "I hope we can all move forward after today," she said. I met her eyes and smiled politely. "I'm sure we will." She mistook my calm for surrender. Most people did. The attorney reached the final pages of the file and paused again. This time the silence lingered. Outside the office window, gray clouds drifted slowly across the Connecticut sky. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as though it were holding its breath. Then the attorney lowered the document and looked toward the closed door. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. And in that instant, I realized this meeting was not unfolding the way Vanessa believed. They thought they had already buried me alongside my husband. They thought the story was over. But somewhere beyond that closed door, a truth none of us were supposed to hear was already on its way. 48 hours before that meeting, I was sitting alone in my kitchen watching rain slide down the window above the sink. The house felt larger than it had when Charles was alive. Not because anything had changed, but because silence occupies more space than people realize. His coffee mug still sat in the cabinet exactly where he had left it. His favorite reading chair remained angled toward the fireplace. Some mornings I caught myself listening for his footsteps before remembering there would not be any. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the breakfast nook. Outside, the maple trees along the driveway swayed gently in the wind. It was the kind of gray Connecticut morning Charles used to enjoy. He would have opened the newspaper, made a comment about the weather, and asked me what I wanted to do with the day. Instead, there was only quiet. Since his funeral, the visits from friends had gradually stopped. Sympathy has a schedule. Life moves forward for everyone else. I understood that. What I did not understand was how quickly Brian and Vanessa had begun discussing business matters that Charles had never trusted them to handle alone. Every conversation seemed to happen without me. Every decision appeared already made by the time I heard about it. At first, I told myself grief was making me suspicious. Then small things started adding up. Documents disappeared from Charles's office. File cabinets that had always remained unlocked were suddenly secured. Questions were answered with smiles instead of facts. I was still thinking about those changes when my phone rang. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I answered, "Hello." For a moment, there was only static. Then a woman's voice spoke quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes." Another pause followed. The caller sounded nervous, as though she was standing somewhere she did not want to be. "You do not know me," she said. "But if I were you, I would not trust the will." I sat up straighter. "Who is this?" No answer. "How did you get my number?" Still nothing. I could hear faint background noise. A door closing. Footsteps. Then the woman spoke again. "Your husband wanted the truth protected." My heart began beating faster. What truth? The line went silent for several seconds, long enough for me to wonder if the call had disconnected. Then came the final sentence. "Someone is counting on you never asking the right questions." The call ended. Just like that. No explanation. No name. No opportunity to call back. I stared at the phone in my hand. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Somewhere in the house, an old floorboard settled with a quiet creak. For several minutes I remained completely still. Part of me wanted to dismiss the call as a prank. Another part could not ignore the feeling settling deep in my stomach. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for problems before they arrived. He trusted very few people with important information. If someone was warning me now, there was a reason. I looked toward the hallway leading to his study. The door stood partially open, and for the first time since his death, I found myself wondering what secrets my husband might have left behind. The rest of that afternoon, I could not stop thinking about the call. I carried my tea into Charles's study and stood quietly in the doorway. The room looked exactly as he had left it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. Family photographs sat neatly arranged on a side table. His leather chair faced the window overlooking the backyard. For a moment, I almost expected him to be sitting there reviewing paperwork as he had done thousands of times before. Instead, the room remained still. I walked to his desk and rested my fingertips against the polished wood surface. Charles had always been organized. Every document had a place. Every account had a record. Every important decision left a paper trail. That was one reason the anonymous warning bothered me so much. If something was wrong with the will, Charles would have anticipated it. Unless someone had interfered after he was gone. I opened the top drawer. Inside were pens, stationery, and several old address books. Nothing unusual. The second drawer contained business records and correspondence from previous years. Again, nothing stood out. Then I reached the locked bottom drawer. I stared at it for several seconds. During our marriage, Charles had never hidden things from me, but there were a few files he preferred to keep private until the appropriate time. Important contracts, sensitive business matters, legal records. I searched his desk until I found a small brass key taped beneath one of the shelves. The discovery did not surprise me. Charles believed in preparation. When the drawer opened, I found several folders stacked neatly inside. Most contained tax records and property information. But one folder immediately caught my attention. It was labeled simply, "Personal." My pulse quickened slightly. I carried it to the desk and opened it carefully. The first few pages were letters Charles had written over the years. Notes about family milestones. Reflections on retirement plans. Thoughts he had never shared aloud. Then I found a document dated nearly 6 years earlier. A financial review prepared by someone named Martha Green. The name seemed familiar. I read the report slowly. Several paragraphs had been highlighted in yellow. Certain transactions were marked for further investigation. Large transfers, missing authorizations, irregular accounting entries. None of the amounts were catastrophic, but together they painted an uncomfortable picture. Someone had questioned the accuracy of company records years ago. At the bottom of the report, Martha had signed her name. Beneath her signature, Charles had written a handwritten note. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Keep this confidential until resolved." I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. A cold feeling settled over me. Why had Charles kept this report? More importantly, why had I never heard about it? I continued searching through the folder. There were references to follow-up meetings, internal reviews, recommendations for additional audits. But after a certain point, the records simply stopped. No conclusion, no explanation, no final report. It was as if the entire matter had vanished. I leaned back in the chair and stared out the window. Rain still drifted across the yard in thin silver lines. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly. Martha Green. The name surfaced again in my thoughts. Then I remembered. She had been one of Charles's most trusted accountants. Reliable, careful, thorough, the kind of person who noticed details others overlooked. Yet I had not heard her name mentioned in years. As evening approached, I picked up my phone and searched for her online. Very little appeared. No recent business profiles. No social media activity. No current address. It was almost as if she had disappeared. And suddenly, I found myself asking a question that refused to leave my mind. If Martha Green had uncovered something important, what had happened to her afterward? That night, I barely slept. The storm had passed, but my mind continued replaying the pieces I had uncovered. Charles had trusted Martha Green enough to preserve her findings. That alone meant something. He respected competence more than charm, facts more than promises. If he had taken the unusual step of storing those records separately, he must have believed they would matter someday. The next morning, I drove into town. Greenwich looked exactly as it always had. Tree-lined streets, carefully maintained storefronts, people carrying coffee cups and moving through their routines. It struck me how ordinary everything seemed while my own understanding of the past was beginning to shift beneath my feet. I stopped at a small cafe Charles and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. The owner still recognized me. We exchanged polite conversation before I settled into a corner booth with my phone and notebook. I began making calls. Former employees, retired managers, anyone who might remember Martha Green. Most conversations ended the same way. Yes, they remembered her. No, they had not seen her in years. Several people described her as meticulous. A few called her stubborn. One former supervisor laughed softly and said Martha had never been afraid to question numbers that did not make sense. That comment stayed with me. Around noon, I reached someone who had worked alongside her for nearly a decade. His name was Harold Bishop. He sounded surprised to hear from me. Martha, he repeated. That is a name I have not heard in a long time. Do you know where she went? I asked. There was a pause. Not exactly. One day she was there. Then she was not. People do not simply disappear. Sometimes they do when they make powerful people uncomfortable. The answer sent a chill through me. What do you mean? Another silence followed. Longer this time. Mrs. Whitmore, I always liked your husband. He was a fair man. But there were tensions during those years. Internal disagreements. Financial questions. Questions about what? That is the strange part. Nobody ever explained. Harold lowered his voice. After Martha raised concerns, certain projects were suddenly reassigned. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Then she left. Did Charles know? I think he knew more than most people. Whether he ever discovered everything, I cannot say. When the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. Through the cafe window, people continued walking past, unaware that a conversation from 6 years ago was beginning to cast a shadow over the present. For the first time, I found myself thinking about Vanessa differently. Before Charles passed away, she had worked hard to appear helpful. She volunteered for committees, organized charity events, remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you cards. Everyone admired her, including me. Yet as I looked back, certain memories no longer felt harmless. The way she always seemed unusually interested in business discussions. The way she asked detailed questions about trusts and property holdings. The way she encouraged Brian to become more involved in company decisions long before Charles believed he was ready. None of those things proved wrongdoing. Not even close. But together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. By the time I left the cafe, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. I returned to my car and opened my notebook. Across the top of a blank page, I wrote 3 words. Martha. Charles. Why? Then I started drawing lines between names, dates, and events. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer searching for answers. I was searching for someone who had spent years making sure those answers remained hidden. The next morning, I returned to Charles's study with a fresh notebook and a determination I had not felt in months. Grief had a way of making time feel slow and heavy, but now something else was pushing me forward. Questions. Too many questions. I began reviewing every document inside the folder Martha Green had prepared. The more carefully I read, the more unusual the pattern became. The transactions she had highlighted were not random. They followed a timeline. Small amounts at first, then larger movements between accounts connected to company projects. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, but enough to attract the attention of a meticulous accountant. Charles had circled several entries in red ink. Next to one page, he had written a short note. Verify source authorization. I stared at those 3 words. Charles never wrote comments unless he intended to investigate further. Yet there was no record showing the matter had ever been resolved. Around noon, I drove to the company headquarters. Since Charles passed away, Brian had spent most of his time there. The building stood exactly as I remembered. Glass walls, clean landscaping, the company logo displayed near the entrance. Employees greeted me politely as I entered, but I noticed something different. Conversations seemed to stop when I walked by. Not completely, just enough to be noticeable. I found Brian in his office reviewing paperwork. Vanessa sat across from him. They both looked surprised to see me. "Mom," Brian said, "you should have called first." I smiled. I was nearby. Vanessa returned the smile immediately. "Too quickly. How nice to see you. We were just discussing transition plans." Transition plans. Another phrase I had heard repeatedly since Charles died. Everything seemed to involve transitions. New responsibilities. New structures. New authority. I glanced at the folders spread across Brian's desk. Several company accounts were listed on the top pages. Vanessa calmly placed one hand over the documents before turning them face down. The gesture lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. "Is everything running smoothly?" I asked. Brian nodded. "Of course." Vanessa added, "Charles built an excellent organization." Her answer sounded perfect. Rehearsed. Safe. Yet something about it felt hollow. I remained only a few minutes before leaving. As I walked back toward the parking lot, an older employee stepped outside behind me. His name was Frank Donnelly. He had worked with Charles for more than 20 years. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called softly. I turned. Frank looked around before speaking again. "Be careful who you trust." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I mean, Charles used to ask questions. Lots of them. Some people did not appreciate that." "Are you talking about Martha Green?" The color drained from his face. "You know about Martha?" "Only a little." Frank lowered his voice. "Then you know more than most." Before I could ask another question, he shook his head. "I have already said too much." He walked away, leaving me standing alone beside my car. On the drive home, his reaction replayed in my mind. Every person connected to Martha seemed uncomfortable, nervous, careful, as though her name itself carried consequences. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had reached a conclusion that frightened me more than any missing document. Martha Green had not uncovered a simple accounting error. She had uncovered something people were still trying very hard to keep buried. Over the next 24 hours, every door I tried seemed to close. I contacted former employees, retired consultants, and even a few attorneys who had crossed paths with Charles over the years. Some never returned my calls. Others claimed they remembered very little. A few sounded genuinely uncomfortable the moment Martha Green's name entered the conversation. It was as if an invisible line existed around that period of the company's history, and nobody wanted to step across it. By Wednesday evening, frustration had begun replacing confidence. I sat alone in the family room with a legal pad full of notes that seemed to lead nowhere. Names connected to other names. Dates connected to meetings. Questions connected to silence. Yet I still lacked the one thing I needed most. Proof. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood. The streetlights flickered on one by one. Across the room, a framed photograph showed Charles standing beside Brian at a company anniversary celebration nearly 10 years earlier. They were both smiling. Looking at that picture made something hurt deep inside me. There had been a time when Brian admired his father completely. A time when integrity mattered more to him than convenience. I wondered when that had changed. Or perhaps the more honest question was whether I had simply failed to notice it changing. My phone buzzed. A text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. "Looking forward to Friday. It will be good to finally settle everything." I stared at the message for several seconds. Settle everything. The confidence behind those words was unmistakable. Vanessa already believed the outcome was decided. She was not worried. She was not uncertain. She was preparing for victory. I set the phone down without responding. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one from Brian. Mom, I know this week has been difficult, but I hope you understand Dad wanted what was best for the company. I read it twice. Then a third time. Not once did he mention what was best for family. Not once did he mention me. The realization settled heavily over me. Whatever Brian believed, he had already accepted a version of events that placed him on one side and me on the other. Later that night, I returned to Charles's study. The room had become both sanctuary and battlefield. I reviewed every document again, hoping I had overlooked something. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. As I gathered the papers, a small envelope slipped from between two folders and landed on the floor. I frowned. I was certain it had not been there before. The envelope was plain, unsealed. My name appeared on the front in Charles's handwriting. My pulse quickened immediately. Carefully, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only one sentence had been written. If Martha ever disappears, trust her findings before you trust anyone else's explanations. I sat frozen in the silence. Charles had written that message years ago. Long before his illness. Long before the funeral. Long before anyone imagined I would be sitting alone searching for answers. He had anticipated something. Not the details perhaps, but the possibility. And suddenly the investigation felt very different. This was no longer about uncovering an old mystery. It was about finishing something my husband had started and never been given the chance to complete. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time all week, I stopped chasing answers. Not because I had found them, but because I had reached the edge of what I could uncover alone. The will reading was less than 24 hours away. Whatever happened next would happen soon. Around noon, I received an invitation that surprised me. Vanessa was hosting a small gathering at their home that evening. According to the message, it was meant to bring everyone together before the legal proceedings. The explanation sounded harmless. The timing did not. I almost declined. Then I decided to attend. Their house sat on a quiet street overlooking a small stretch of protected woodland. When I arrived, several guests were already there. Family friends, a few company associates, even two members of the local country club Charles had belonged to for years. The atmosphere felt strangely celebratory. Glasses clinked. People laughed. Conversations drifted through the rooms with an ease that seemed completely disconnected from the circumstances. Vanessa greeted me warmly at the door. Too warmly. Eleanor, I am so glad you came. Her smile was flawless. Her confidence even more so. Brian appeared moments later and kissed my cheek before returning almost immediately to a discussion with several executives. Watching them move through the crowd, I realized something important. Neither of them looked worried. They looked relieved, as though a long process was finally ending exactly the way they had expected. Throughout the evening, I overheard fragments of conversation, plans for future leadership, expansion strategies, new investment opportunities. One guest congratulated Brian on what he called the next chapter. Another mentioned how proud Charles would have been to see the company remain under strong management. Nobody spoke openly about the will, yet everyone seemed to assume the outcome. Vanessa never corrected them. In fact, she subtly encouraged it. Later, while standing near the patio doors, I noticed her speaking privately with an attorney I recognized from several company events. They stopped talking the moment they saw me looking in their direction. Vanessa smiled and raised her glass. The attorney quickly excused himself. It was a small moment, but small moments often reveal more than dramatic ones. As the evening continued, I felt increasingly isolated. Not because anyone treated me poorly. Quite the opposite. Everyone was polite, respectful, careful. Yet beneath their kindness existed an uncomfortable certainty that my role in the story was ending. I was the widow, the grieving wife, the person being left behind while others moved forward. Driving home later that night, I could not shake that feeling. The investigation had produced questions, but very few answers. Martha remained missing. The financial records remained incomplete. Time was running out. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a painful possibility had begun forming in my mind. Perhaps Vanessa was right to feel confident. Perhaps Brian really would inherit everything. Perhaps Charles's warning had arrived too late. I sat in the darkened car for several minutes before finally stepping outside. As I walked toward the front door, my phone vibrated. A new message had arrived from an unknown number. There were only 7 words on the screen. Check the attic before sunrise. Trust nobody. I stood in the foyer staring at the message on my phone. The house was silent around me. For a moment, I considered the possibility that someone was playing a cruel game. Anonymous calls. Anonymous messages. Half-finished clues. None of it made sense. Yet every instinct told me to take the warning seriously. I barely slept that night. At 5:30 in the morning, long before sunrise, I carried a flashlight upstairs and climbed the narrow pull-down ladder leading to the attic. Charles and I had lived in this house for more than 30 years. We rarely visited the attic anymore. It had become a place where old holiday decorations, family keepsakes, and forgotten boxes quietly collected dust. The air smelled faintly of cedar and aging cardboard. My flashlight swept across rows of storage containers. For nearly an hour, I searched without finding anything unusual. Then I remembered something Charles used to say whenever we misplaced an important document. The answer is usually hiding where nobody bothers to look twice. I slowly walked back through the attic, paying closer attention. Near the far corner, behind several old moving boxes, I noticed a wooden trunk I did not recognize. It was not hidden exactly, just overlooked. The trunk was covered in dust, suggesting it had been sitting there for years. I knelt beside it and brushed away enough dirt to reveal a brass nameplate. My heart immediately began racing. The plate contained only 2 initials. C.W. Charles Whitmore. The lock was not secured. When I lifted the lid, I found dozens of carefully organized folders. Property records, insurance policies, tax documents. At first glance, everything appeared routine. Then I discovered a sealed envelope attached to the underside of the lid. Written across the front were 5 words in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. For Eleanor. If necessary. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated almost 4 years earlier. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and began reading. Charles explained that he had become increasingly concerned about discrepancies inside certain company accounts. He mentioned internal resistance whenever questions were raised. More importantly, he mentioned Martha Green repeatedly. According to the letter, Martha had uncovered irregular transactions connected to several business entities. Charles believed additional evidence existed but had not yet been located. Then came a paragraph that made my stomach tighten. If you are reading this, circumstances may have prevented me from finishing what Martha and I started. Trust the records. Trust the facts. And if anyone tries to rush you toward a conclusion, ask yourself why they are in such a hurry. I read the sentence 3 times. Rush you toward a conclusion. Suddenly Vanessa's behavior looked different. The urgency surrounding the will. The celebration the night before. The assumption that everything was already decided. It all seemed connected somehow. Beneath the letter rested a small notebook. Most pages contained financial references I did not fully understand. But one page featured a handwritten address. No explanation. No notes. Just an address in rural Vermont. I stared at it for several seconds. The location meant nothing to me. Yet something deep inside whispered that it mattered. As dawn finally broke beyond the attic window, I slipped the notebook into my purse. The will reading was only hours away. And for the first time since this began, I felt certain that Charles had left me one final trail to follow. The address stayed in my thoughts during the entire drive. Rural Vermont was nearly 300 miles from Greenwich, far enough to feel disconnected from everything Charles and I had built. Yet the fact that he had written it down and preserved it inside a hidden trunk told me it was important. I left immediately. The highway stretched north beneath a pale morning sky. Mile after mile passed while questions circled endlessly through my mind. Who lived at that address? Why had Charles kept it secret? And most importantly, what connection did it have to Martha Green? By early afternoon, I turned onto a narrow country road lined with pine trees and stone fences. The address led to a small white farmhouse sitting at the end of a gravel driveway. The property looked quiet. Too quiet. No vehicles. No movement. No sign that anyone had been there recently. My stomach tightened as I parked beside the mailbox and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, birds called from the trees. I approached the front porch and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. For several minutes, I stood there hoping someone would appear. Nobody did. The curtains remained still. The windows reflected only the cloudy afternoon sky. Eventually, I walked around the side of the house. Everything seemed abandoned. Not neglected exactly, just empty, as though someone had left without intending to return. Disappointment settled heavily over me. After everything, after the anonymous warnings and hidden records and long drive, I had reached another dead end. I sat on the porch steps and stared across the open field behind the house. For the first time in days, doubt returned. Perhaps I had misunderstood the clue. Perhaps Charles himself never discovered what happened. Perhaps the truth was gone forever. Then I noticed something attached beneath the mailbox. A small metal lockbox. It was old and weathered. Most people would have missed it completely. My pulse quickened. I knelt beside it. The box was unlocked. Inside rested a single envelope. My name was written on the front. Not printed. Handwritten. The moment I saw the handwriting, my breath caught. It was not Charles's. It was Martha's signature from the financial report. I recognized it immediately. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a brief note. If you found this, then Charles was right to trust you. I could not stay. Too many people wanted these records forgotten. But I kept copies. The truth still exists. Beneath the note was a business card with a phone number written on the back. Nothing else. No address. No explanation. No evidence. Just a number. I stared at it for several seconds. Martha was alive. She had been here. More importantly, she had expected someone to come looking. For the first time since this investigation began, I felt genuine hope. Then I checked the time. The will reading was less than 2 hours away. I was still hundreds of miles from Connecticut. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. If Martha truly possessed the records Charles had spent years protecting, then somebody else might already know she still existed. The drive back to Connecticut felt longer than the trip north. Every few minutes I glanced at the business card resting on the passenger seat beside me. The phone number seemed impossibly small compared to the weight it carried. Martha Green was alive. She had expected someone to find that farmhouse. More importantly, she had left evidence that Charles had not imagined any of this. Yet as the miles passed beneath my tires, another reality became impossible to ignore. I was running out of time. The will reading was scheduled for that afternoon. Traffic thickened as I approached the city. The clock on the dashboard seemed to move faster with every passing minute. Twice I considered calling the number. Twice I stopped myself. If Martha had gone to such lengths to stay hidden, there had to be a reason. A phone call could wait. The meeting could not. By the time I arrived at the attorney's office, the parking lot was already crowded. I sat in the car for a moment, collecting myself. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than usual. Tired. Determined. Alone. I slipped Charles's letter and Martha's note into my purse before walking inside. The conference room was already filling with people. Brian stood near the window speaking with 2 executives from the company. Vanessa sat comfortably at the table, her confidence practically glowing. Several guests greeted me politely as I entered. Their smiles carried the same quiet assumption I had seen at the gathering the night before. The future had already been decided. Or so they believed. Vanessa looked up and smiled. Eleanor, we were beginning to worry. Traffic, I replied calmly. It happens. She nodded as though my answer confirmed something. Across the room, Brian offered a brief wave before returning to his conversation. Neither of them asked where I had been. Neither of them seemed curious. Their attention was focused entirely on what came next. The attorney entered carrying a thick folder and took his seat at the head of the table. Conversation faded immediately. Chairs shifted. Papers rustled. The room settled into silence. I recognized several faces from company events over the years. Some appeared sympathetic. Others appeared eager. A few looked almost relieved. The attorney adjusted his glasses and opened the file. Thank you all for coming, he began. Today we will review the final estate directives left by Charles Whitmore. Vanessa folded her hands neatly in front of her. Brian leaned forward slightly. I watched them both. They looked like people standing on the edge of a finish line. The reading began. Legal terminology filled the room. Trust structures, property allocations, corporate interests. Several assets were assigned exactly as expected. With each passing page, Vanessa appeared more relaxed. Brian's shoulders loosened. The executives exchanged satisfied glances. Then came the major holdings. The company, the controlling interests, the authority Charles had spent decades building. The attorney cleared his throat and continued reading. Around the table, expressions brightened. Vanessa's smile widened. One guest even began taking notes. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a celebration. I remained silent, partly because I had no proof, partly because I wanted to see how confident they would become. By the time the attorney reached the final section, Vanessa could barely conceal her satisfaction. Brian looked as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The room had already decided the outcome. Then the attorney stopped speaking. His eyes moved toward the closed conference room door. A strange silence settled over the room. Not confusion, anticipation, as though something unexpected had just entered the equation. Slowly, the attorney lowered the document in his hands. And for the first time all afternoon, Vanessa's smile began to fade. Nobody spoke. The silence seemed to stretch across the entire room. The attorney continued staring toward the door. Several people turned in their chairs to see what had captured his attention. Vanessa followed their gaze, irritation flickering briefly across her face. She looked as though someone had interrupted a carefully planned performance. Then the conference room door opened. An older woman stepped inside. She wore a dark blue coat and carried a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. For a second, nobody reacted. Most of the people in the room did not recognize her. I did. The moment I saw her face, every question that had consumed the past week seemed to stop moving all at once. Martha Green. She looked older than the photographs I had found. More tired, but unmistakably the same person. The same careful eyes. The same quiet presence. Across the table, Brian frowned in confusion. Vanessa's expression changed completely. It happened so quickly that most people would have missed it. Surprise. Then recognition. Then something else. Concern. Martha closed the door behind her and stood calmly beside it. Nobody rushed to greet her. Nobody seemed to know what to say. The attorney slowly rose from his chair. "Ms. Green," he said, "I was not certain you would come." "Neither was I," Martha replied. Her voice was steady. "But Charles asked me to do something if the time ever came." The room remained silent. Vanessa forced a smile. "I am sorry," she said. "Have we met?" Martha looked directly at her. "Yes, several times." The smile disappeared. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I noticed several executives exchanging confused glances. They clearly recognized the name. More importantly, they recognized the tension that suddenly filled the room. Martha walked toward the conference table and placed the leather portfolio in front of the attorney. The sound seemed unusually loud. "These belong with the estate records," she said. The attorney nodded slowly. He opened the portfolio and began reviewing the contents. As he turned the pages, his expression grew increasingly serious. Vanessa leaned forward. "What exactly is this?" she asked. Martha did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room. Several years ago, Charles authorized an internal review of company accounts. During that review, I discovered transactions that required further investigation. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Charles instructed me to preserve copies of every record. The attorney continued examining the documents, one page after another. The room felt smaller with each passing second. Brian glanced toward Vanessa. For the first time all afternoon, he looked uncertain. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Surely this has nothing to do with today's proceedings." Martha finally met her eyes again. "It has everything to do with today's proceedings." A murmur spread through the room. The attorney lifted another document from the portfolio, then another, then a sealed envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Charles's. The attorney stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully opening it. Nobody spoke while he read the contents. Outside the conference room windows, gray clouds drifted slowly across the Connecticut sky. Inside, every person seemed frozen in place. Finally, the attorney lowered the letter and looked directly at Martha. "You kept all of it?" Martha nodded once. "Every page." Vanessa's confidence was gone now. Completely gone. For the first time since this meeting began, she looked like someone who understood that the ending she expected might no longer belong to her. The attorney carefully arranged the documents across the conference table while every person in the room watched. Nobody seemed interested in the original will anymore. The attention had shifted entirely to the materials Martha Green had preserved for years. I remained silent. Across from me, Brian looked increasingly uncomfortable. He kept glancing between Martha, the attorney, and Vanessa as though trying to understand a conversation that had started long before he entered the room. Vanessa, however, had stopped pretending everything was normal. The calm confidence she carried earlier had been replaced by calculation. I could almost see her searching for a way to regain control of the situation. The attorney lifted one of the accounting reports. These records document a series of transactions that were flagged for further review, he said. According to the attached correspondence, Charles Whitmore personally authorized an expanded investigation. A murmur spread through the room. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. Martha remained standing quietly beside the table. The investigation was never completed, she said. Not because there was no evidence. Because key records disappeared before the review could be finalized. Vanessa immediately spoke. That does not prove wrongdoing. Her voice was firm, but not as firm as before. The attorney nodded. Correct. By itself, it does not. Then he lifted another document from the portfolio. However, this does raise additional concerns. He continued reading. Internal memos, audit requests, financial summaries. Each document seemed to add another piece to a puzzle Charles had been assembling for years. Then the attorney opened the envelope containing Charles's letter. The room fell silent once again. This statement was signed and notarized, he explained. Mr. Whitmore specifically instructed that it be presented if evidence emerged suggesting that estate decisions may have been influenced by incomplete or inaccurate financial disclosures. I saw Brian's face pale slightly. What does that mean? He asked. The attorney looked directly at him. It means your father anticipated the possibility that certain information had not yet come to light. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Martha reached into the portfolio one final time. She removed a thin folder that appeared older than the rest. The edges were worn. The paper slightly faded. This is why I came, she said quietly. The attorney accepted the folder and opened it. His eyes widened almost immediately. Whatever he was reading had not been included in the other documents. Several pages later, he slowly exhaled. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, there appears to be another estate directive. The room erupted with confusion. Questions came from every direction. Brian looked stunned. Vanessa stared at the folder without blinking. My own heart pounded against my chest. Another estate directive. Another document Charles had protected. The attorney raised his hand for silence. This document predates the will currently being reviewed. More importantly, it references conditions under which the distribution of assets must be reconsidered. Martha finally sat down for the first time since arriving. She looked exhausted, relieved. As though she had spent years carrying a burden, she could finally sit down. Across the table, Vanessa's expression hardened. For the first time, she looked afraid. Not of losing money, not of losing status. Afraid of what might happen once every page inside that folder became part of the official record. And as the attorney turned to the first page of the newly discovered directive, I realized the truth Charles had spent years protecting was finally about to speak for itself.